Okay, let's start with yin and yang, the binary code that, according to the philosophy of the oracle, all of the universe is comprised of. In the same way that ones and zeros represent all computer processor instructions, yin and yang, or yin yang, represent all divine instructions for creation and destruction. So the exoteric, exoteric value of yin corresponds with that which is considered dark, submissive energy, yielding, receptive, curved, and lower. The exoteric value of yang corresponds with that which is light, dominant, assertive, giving, straight, and higher. Now, the esoteric, ESO, the esoteric value of yin energy from a practitioner standpoint is destruction. It's the lower vibrational realms, so that includes the underworld, demons, hell, ghosts, and darker spirit forces. That's how you would use yin, and that is going to be yin enriched. Now, the esoteric or occult value of yang energy is creation. It's higher vibrational realms. It's attunement to those angelic or diva realms. So that includes, like I said, angels, divas, bodhisattvas, ascended masters, the eight immortals, celestial spirits, and higher forms of energies. So just as an aside, a quick note on Taoist magical philosophy. If you're using the hexagrams in craft, when you're petitioning for a celestial spirit, you're going to opt for a hexagram that's yang or yang dominant. There's also this notion that for an exorcism, you're going to want to use a yang dominant hexagram to eradicate the otherwise yin dominant lower realm spirit or demon. Now, if you're trying to summon a demon, or you're working with the underworld, or working or summoning, petitioning hungry ghosts, then you're going to opt for a yin dominant hexagram. Okay, now let's say you're seeking to perform spellcrafting where the movement of energy is about amplifying, creating, maximizing, increasing, attracting, magnifying, or expanding in some way. Then you're going to want to work with a hexagram that's either yang dominant or contains prominently placed yang lines within the six yao or the six lined hexagram. Now, if you're spellcrafting for the purposes of decreasing, binding, destroying, hexing, removing, or banishing something that you don't want anymore, removal, this is to be distinguished actually from banishing a demon. I'm just talking about sort of mundane, low magic forms of banishings, or reduction of any kind. Then the form of energy that you're going to be working with is going to be yin. So you're going to look for a hexagram to work with in craft that's yin dominant, or one of the more prominent lines in the hexagram is going to be yin. Sorry, this talk should have really belonged under the section I Ching and occultism. I'm kind of getting a little bit ahead of myself again and going off on tangents, but I know you'll forgive me. Okay, back to the topic at hand, interpreting a reading. Where were we? Okay, we were talking about yin and yang. So one way you interpret a hexagram is to ignore the text and verses altogether and to scry into the six yao or the six lines of the hexagram diagram or the picture. Over on the left, we have an example, hexagram 51, or thunder over thunder. But let's neglect all of that for a moment and deconstruct this hexagram down to its binary coding. Remember, the four states of yin and yang based on the permutations of how they mate with each other, as noted in the diagram over on the right of your screen. Now let's study line 1, where the result was a changing yang line. Remember from the video workshops and supplemental handouts that the X marks a changing line. A changing yang line in the coin toss method was produced from 3 heads. When you see a changing yang line or adjusting yang line, that is the state of the binary or two-line coding you'll want to envision in your mind. Adjusting yang is going to transition into yin. Now let's study line 2, where the result was an unchanging yin line. An unchanging yin line was produced from 2 tails and 1 head. When you see an unchanging yin line or plenary yin, absolute yin, that's the two-line code you'll want to think of in your head. Moving on to line 3, here we have a changing yin line marked by that X. The changing yin line is produced from 3 tails in a coin toss. A changing yin line or adjusting yin is yin transitioning into yang. So that is the binary code you'll want to envision when you see a changing yin line. Now one more example, line 4. Line 4 is an unchanging yang line. When the coin toss result is 2 heads and 1 tail, you get the unchanging yang line. For an unchanging yang line, think of the plenary yang or double yang as you see among the 4 states of yin and yang. Remember, yin is a darker, more yielding, more degenerative energy, while yang is a lighter, more assertive, more creative energy. And the two push, pull, work together, work against each other in these 4 states that are each encoded into 6 lines. And this binary code, this final product of that chemistry, tells a story. It forms a narrative and produces something in this material world. So looking at the 4 states of yin and yang, let's re-examine the hexagram. Visualize the chemistry of states for that 3-line lower trigram as noted by the 6 lines to the right. Here we have thunder over thunder, but the binary code for the lower trigram is going to be different from the upper trigram because of those 2 X's or changing lines in the lower trigram, whereas the upper trigram has no changing lines. We see something placid, stable, ordered on the top, but something very different from that lurks below. A lot of instability and volatility below the surface that's making its way upward to disrupt that upper or surface level order. How do you interpret that? Something feels afoot, doesn't it? There is an unseen storm below the surface, and it is inevitable that the storm is going to rise up to disrupt that surface level order. Now, at this time, in your I Ching book, turn to the entry for hexagram 51 and read the text for the oracle section. Go on, do it. That way you can see the origins of each hexagram's meaning and how we get that narrative from these 6 lines of code. In the showcased example, that primary hexagram, due to its first and third changing lines, changes into the secondary hexagram you see on the right, thunder over mountain, or hexagram 62. Pay attention to detail. If you notice the details going on below the surface that aren't readily apparent, then you will detect the shift that's coming. That center column of 12-line code, the deconstruction of the primary and secondary hexagrams into the 4 states, is the true divination here, because that center column of 12-line code represents both the primary and secondary hexagrams together as a cohesive revelation of the oracle. Here, pause the video, reverse engineer this reading result, and read both hexagrams 51 and 62 and lines 1 and 3 for hexagram 51. Consider the 4 states of yin and yang and the binary code that is the true architecture of the divination result. Are you able to see where the interpretation for hexagram 51 and 62 are coming from based on that binary coding? In an I Ching reading, start by assessing the fundamental elements or the building blocks of the hexagram results. Those building blocks are the trigrams. Here we see the trigram thunder and the correspondences for this particular building block. Often these correspondences are going to offer revelations or signs and omens that can be predictive of what's to come, or these correspondences help to diagnose the problem at hand. For example, maybe the matter in question relates to something that involves the throat chakra or the archetype of the emperor. If the question presented had asked about timing, consider the timing correspondences for thunder, and of course you'll want to assess the timing correspondences for the trigrams formed in the secondary hexagram after the changing lines. If it was a medical question, consider the medical correspondences for the trigram thunder. After you assess the trigrams, the fundamental building blocks for the divination result, and what those building blocks might reveal about the fundamentals of the situation, then take a step back and assess the two hexagrams. In this particular reading, observe which trigram here is not like the others. The lower trigram from that secondary hexagram over on the right is mountain. So here you'd want to deconstruct and assess that fundamental building block, this change, this anomaly, which is going to reveal the forecast here. If you have your I Ching book on hand for the divination operation, you turn to the page for the trigram mountain and, with intuition open, scan the correspondences to see what sticks to you as the forecast that relates to the matter at hand. So now that you understand the binary code composition for an I Ching reading result, I can explain one approach to interpreting a reading. It's to scry into these 6 lines of the hexagram with your intuition opened and receive the messages from the oracle as if those divinatory messages were being channeled to you in some way. So to draw a comparison to tarot that might be helpful to some of you, let's turn over to the world of tarot so that we can kind of bring a point of comparison. So this is the Empress card. Let's say in a tarot reading, you pull the Empress card. Okay, so how does a tarot reader interpret this card? Let's say you happen to know some basic essential meanings for this card. It's about productivity, multiplication, fertility, nurture, nourishment, manifesting abundance. So then you would apply those meanings to the question in hand. Now, in an I Ching reading, once you get the image of a hexagram, perhaps you look into the I Ching book for the hexagram oracle entry, you read the passage in there, and then you apply the significance of the oracular passages to the question at hand. Now, another way to read a tarot card is intuitively, as they say, or with your psychic senses open and to scry into the imagery on the card. Let's say you're scrying into the imagery of the Empress card and you pick up on the 12 stars, for example, on her crown. So the 12 stars are symbolic of the 12 constellations that make up the zodiac. Or maybe you're drawn to the astrological correspondences for the Empress card, which is Venus, and you think on the divinatory significance of Venus for that question at hand. So, or you might look at the front foreground with the golden wheat and you wonder how that signifies as an omen or a symbol for the question that's been asked. So identifying these isolated components is a bit like, identifying the correspondences for a trigram and a hexagram. And, it's a little bit like reading the binary code. And, just like in the card, you're going into the symbolism. In a hexagram, you're dipping into the symbolism and the correspondences for the yin and yang lines, the binary code, and then also the two hexagrams, the two trigrams that make up the hexagram. Ultimately, the 6 lines of a hexagram represent, as I had said, a binary code that tells a picture story that gives you a divinatory or revelation that's in the form of a narrative. So you can read those 6 lines of yin and yang like reading the lines of computer programming. The text or the verses of the I Ching Book of Changes, which is the book portion that you receive among your course materials, it represents what practitioners believe sort of on the superstitious level. This is not, of course, rooted in scholarly material. This is more sort of the superstitions of Chinese Taoist magical practitioners, is that the prose poetry of the I Ching Book of Changes was channeled, and therefore it is a sacred text. It's given a lot of value because it's believed to be brought down to and manifest in the material world by the celestial king, by the Shangdi. By heaven. So we do look at it in terms of as a system of bibliomancy because it is a sacred text that's channeled, so you can use the word of God, so to speak, to divine or to prophesize. Again, if you scry into the diagram, if you're looking at the sort of deconstructed components in the anatomy of a hexagram, then the system of divination you're using is not necessarily bibliomancy, it's going to be claromancy. So that's the sort of the conundrum that you see confronted when you're looking at the I Ching. It is both bibliomancy and claromancy. It's not one or the other in a right-wrong way. You can talk, and this is definitely something practitioners and scholars do, which is to debate and argue which came first, which is the original form, which is the truest form, the purest way to do it. I don't know if that's necessarily a productive argument to have. I think you just have to have your intuition open as a practitioner and see whether or not the claromantic form of I Ching divination appeals to you more, or the bibliomancy form of divination appeals to you more, or if you're going to sort of integrate the various components and create sort of produce your own sort of unique signature way of divining with the I Ching as a practitioner of craft. Now, going back to the tarot deck, you see a lot of tarot readers talk about, whether or not you take a psychological approach that's a little more grounded in social psychology, sciences, if you will, or whether or not it's channeling spirit guides, and whether it's psychic, whether it's mediumship, or whether it's intuitive reading. All of these debates, but I think ultimately a lot of tarot readers agree that to be a masterful reader, you sort of need to have a balance of both. You need to be intuitive, really in touch with your clairvoyance, clairsentience, your four clairs, your psychic abilities, but at the same time, you do need to have a very strong foundational, scholarly, in a sense, knowledge of what the card meanings are. So the I Ching is the same way, where you sort of integrate both the claromancy format of the divinatory system and the bibliomancy format of the system, and sort of work with the two in a balanced, juggled kind of way that works for you personally as an individual practitioner. So don't listen to other people who might say one is right, the other is wrong, or those sort of nonsensical debates. In my view, nonsensical debates. I think this is something where you really want to connect directly with the book by yourself and figure out for yourself the best approach to divination and interpreting each hexagram. As you went through the different divination methods, I think intuitively, or maybe even just in terms of your preferences, you'll feel drawn toward one particular divination method, and maybe at the dismissal of the others. And I'm going to ask you to not do that right away. Even if you know, okay, the coin toss method is going to be my approach, or I'm just a yarrow stock type of person, before you sort of commit to one divination method with the I Ching, if you've bothered to take this class and you've bothered to put in all of the work and the resources into having this class available to you, I ask that you try every single methodology at least 3 times. So try the yarrow stock method, the long traditional form, at least 3 times before you dismiss it. Don't do it once, get frustrated, and stop. Really do it 3 times and record all three divination experiences. Write and document. Same with the short form yarrow stock divination, the rice grains. Even if you think that the rice grain sounds tedious and ridiculous, maybe it is going to be tedious and ridiculous for you, and after you do it 3 times, you're just confirmed that you're absolutely right. But go to the lengths of confirming that you're absolutely right about what you like and what you don't like, okay? So do me a huge favor and try every single divination method a minimum of 3 times, and document your divinatory experiences with every single try. And then after you've tried it all, then you can reach your conclusion, all right? Okay, to demonstrate some of the more mundane forms of I Ching reading interpretations, I have actual readings. I just wrote it out a little bit, but so that I can stay on track. But these are actual readings. I'm just going to show you, sort of walk you through the case study and how you actually unpack the divinatory result. So the first question the querent asked about summer travel plans, and they are consulting the I Ching to figure out what to do in terms of summer travel plans, or what's in store for the summer, or what's the best way to utilize the summer months or the summer season this year. And it was through the rice grains divination method. And the rice grains divination method yielded hexagram 31, line 3. I'm going to turn to it so that I can consult it as well. And so after you get the result, the first thing that a reader might want to do is to look at the trigrams. So the trigrams is lake over mountain. So you're going to look at lake and what lake has to do with and what mountain. So mountain, you see this idea of knowledge. There's some educational value this summer. So, workshops, educational stuff, something that has to do with knowledge seeking is going to be important for the summer. We haven't even gotten to the hexagram yet. We're just looking at the trigrams because of the mountain. If you want to talk about travel, there's this idea. So mountain it corresponds with the direction northeast. And so there's this idea maybe northeast, lake is west, so these are ideas to look into. Lake is also about fertility, and so there's this idea of fertility or development, something that needs to be cultivated over the summer. So cultivation of knowledge is probably something that's important. And again, at this point, the only thing we've looked at are the trigrams. Then we look at the actual hexagram, and this is hexagram 31. And so there's this idea of young love. So maybe maybe a romantic chemistry of some kind, or a summer love of some kind, and it could be at some kind of educational program or something where it was meant to go seek knowledge. For example, summer school, some kind of, and you go to a summer school, or you take a summer semester of courses at a university, and in that platform or in that arena you meet a romantic pair, like a romantic prospect. And so that sort of is one way to interpret it, and that was actually the interpretation in that very specific reading. So when you read hexagram 31, read the entry and then read line 3, read what it says in the book, and then what I just told you was the interpretation, and kind of see how they fit together, how the application process worked. The third line here, so another part of the divination was there may be young love, or it might be a romantic prospect, but it's not one that's going to last. It looks like it's sort of, like a quick flame. It burns very brightly and then it burns out. So it's like a summer love, but it's not something that's sort of going to lead to marriage. It doesn't look like something that's going to bring enduring happiness. And then another thing is, for line 3, another concept from line 3 was don't chase. You want to attract. So another advice that comes from hexagram 31 plus line 3 is don't go chasing things. Attract them to you. Try to draw them toward you. Be magnetic. So if you want something, especially that potential love interest, don't go chasing. Have them come to you. And that's sort of the advice that the I Ching would have on that count. So the next example, the question that the querent had asked was, what do they most need to know about their career? It was a career-oriented question. And again, so a lot of times these questions don't necessarily come as, a yes or a no, or a very specific inquiry, just, a subject matter. So this was, what can you tell this querent about their career, especially the future of their career? They want to know where their career track is headed. The result, and I do want you to take out your book like a textbook and follow along, write down these hexagrams and read it to get a sense of what the divinatory result was, and follow along. So the question was about career. Where is his career track, and where is his career track going to go in the future? The result was hexagram 53, and this, I don't think I wrote down how I got this. It might be the 3 coin toss method. I think it was the 3 coin toss method. So it was hexagram 53, lines 3 and 5. So lines 3 and 5 were the changing lines. And then the hexagram 53 with lines 3 and 5 changes into hexagram 23. So you want to look at hexagram 53 and hexagram 23 in your book. Now, the way this was interpreted was that this person seemed very prodigious and got too far too fast, and ascended too quickly, so that a very strong foundation was not built. It feels like this individual might be, head honcho or a big shot wherever he is right now, but he hasn't built a very strong, broad, and wide foundation. He shot up too quickly in one place. He didn't spread out his roots, or he put all of his eggs in one basket, so to speak. So there's going to be a crash, going to fall, where he's not going to know what he wants to do. He's going to feel like he's on a plateau because he didn't take it slow and steady. But ultimately, what he's going to do is he's going to have to sort of go back to square one, feel like the apprentice again. But at that time, he's going to build a much broader base, and he will be able to rise up from that position. So there's this idea of having risen too fast, too soon, and so there does need to be some kind of a partition, some kind of a split, a division of some kind. And then once there's that divisive energy, that divisive force that he creates, then he's able to take a healthier career track, one that has a wider base and has stronger foundation, and less likely to fall or tumble. And so that was the reading based on that. And again, how I do the readings is I give them the full text, and most people find that the text itself is incredibly insightful and enriching in terms of the oracle speaking directly to them. So in my personal approach to I Ching readings, I don't do a lot of interpretation. I just give them the text and I have them connect directly with the oracle. Now, again, that's not the right way, or that's really literally just one way that people approach I Ching readings. Another approach is for the practitioner to step in and do the interpretation. I tend not to do the interpretation. I tend to do the work ahead of time. And like I said, I like to sort of study the I Ching first, get my text going, and then I give them just the message that was channeled way before they came to me for the divination. And usually that channeled message has something to do with their life. And so that's the way I do the readings. So here's another question. The question was, should I marry John? Now, the querent wants to know whether or not she should marry John. The result was a locked hexagram. This is, again, the coin toss method, and we got hexagram 25 locked. So I want you to read the entry for hexagram 25 and just the oracle section and get a sense of how you would answer the question. Should she marry John? And then you get the oracle section of hexagram 25. Now, the way I interpreted this, I would say that John and her are not a perfect match. You have heaven and thunder, and so there's this idea of thunder going to be restless paired with heaven. So thunder wants to go farther, wants to shine. There's more that this thunder wants to do that heaven is going to, I presume heaven is John, in fact, actually. So I feel like John might hold her back. She wants to do a lot more and incite more that John is not going to be ready for. John imposes boundaries and limitations around her that she doesn't want, and so that might be problematic. I see her as seeking being thunder. I see her as seeking expansion, and I see that the heaven restricts. They can be a power couple, though, because both heaven and thunder are so strong and so powerful in their own right in terms of their separate trigrams. You have this idea of a power couple superficially. When people see them, they look like a power couple. If she stays with John, John represents financial security. Nobody would fault her for marrying John for financial security. Again, they are that power couple, but I don't see John necessarily as an ideal romantic love based on hexagram 25. If thunder mates with heaven, thunder will always be unsatisfied. Thunder and heaven, it's not a bad pairing, it's not a bad compatibility, it's just that I don't know if thunder would be satisfied with heaven. There's always going to feel like they need to be more or do more or shine or be brighter. Whenever you're doing a romance, this is another sort of, side note. If you're doing a romance reading where people are asking a question about love and you're using the I Ching, a lot of practitioners are just they're going to look more at the trigrams, at the pairing of the trigrams. So they're going to look at the chemistry of the upper trigram and the lower trigram. Now, in terms of traditionally how it was read versus how you might read it in the 21st century, there's a bit of a dissonance. So how I was taught, and sort of like the really traditional, again, gender normative way, is that usually the upper trigram represents the man and the lower trigram represents the woman, presuming that everybody's in a straight relationship and it's always a husband and wife. And so that's problematic in the 21st century. It's extremely problematic. So I look at it now as the upper trigram represents the yang energy in a relationship, and the lower trigram represents the yin energy. And no matter what the genders are in any pairing, even like your best friend, when you get together with your best friend, you get together with your sister, like any relationship, anytime two people come together, one tends to be more yin and one tends to be more yang in that specific pairing. So every pair, somebody's going to just be more yin, somebody's going to be more yang. That's how the pairs kind of fit together. And so you look at it that way. So you try to figure out who in that specific relationship is more yang. That's the upper trigram. Who's more yin? That is going to be the lower trigram if you're using the I Ching for love and romance questions. Okay, now let's do a hypothetical. So let's say the question is, why is my career not successful? So the question is, why is my career not successful? And now it's still hexagram 25. So let's say, again, the result was hexagram 25. It was a locked hexagram for the question, why is my career not successful? So now in terms of reading the same exact hexagram that we just read for love, here we see, okay, well, in terms of your career path, this person, you're not doing anything wrong. Your merit is there, your abilities are there, qualifications are there. So it's not a merit issue. It's not about meritorious matters. At this time, I think you're seeking expansion and you're seeking change, but the only way to get that change is through a jolt, a sudden shift. The thunder, that's where the thunder comes in. That's how you're interpreting the thunder trigram. So if you want success in your career, it needs to be like a sudden movement, like a tower movement, if you know tarot references, but it needs to be a jolt of some kind for you to awaken into an area of success. And right now, you're a little bit more reactive or responsive and passive. You're waiting for things to happen to you rather than going out and creating the jolt. So if you do want success, you have to create a jolt of some kind. Also, in terms of why your career might not be successful right now, maybe you don't love your job. There's this idea of, I don't know what career path you're in, but there's a lack of passion. I see like a listlessness. I see feeling a lack of energy. There's a lack of passion. There's a lack of excitement for this thing. And so when you're not excited, when you're not like passionate, it's very hard to put in the work and the investment to be successful. And so maybe you want to find something where maybe it doesn't seem like it's as financially secure, but because you're passionate about it, you make it financially successful, and that career path is successful for you because of the passion. So that's how you would read hexagram 25, same exact hexagram earlier for the love question, for a career question. Now, in terms of what kind of questions can you ask the I Ching? Okay, so this is going to go to your specific relationship with the I Ching. I feel like once you get to work with the oracle, it's going to take on a life of its own. It seems to have its own personality, and how that personality as it presents itself to you may be a little bit different from its personality as it presents itself to me. And we all have different relationships with the oracle, with our divine mother and our divine father. And so some people do use the I Ching quite successfully for fortune telling, for predictions, and for asking questions that relate to love, relationships, everyday stuff. For me personally, it has never worked out that well for me. I find that, so for example, I can use the tarot to forecast the trajectory of my stocks. I use the tarot for the stock market all of the time, and it works, it's pretty effective. I can't do it with the I Ching for some reason. But at the same time, I don't find myself being that effective at reading for myself with the tarot if it's a question that's really important to me. That's, where the stakes are very high. But if I go to the I Ching with one of those emotionally vulnerable questions where the stakes are very high, I can do a reading for myself with, a lot of power and accuracy. I did want to talk a little bit about ethical guidelines when it comes to the I Ching. So, in terms of Taoist magic and Chinese Taoist mystery traditions, our history and the cultural context for it, there aren't any sort of collective or even unspoken regulations when it comes to ethics. It's, everything goes, right? But what's more specific are mystery traditions, or specific, what we call lineages, pai. If you're part of a specific lineage, then there's absolutely ethical guidelines that are dictated by your lineage, and you would follow to the letter whatever the ethical guidelines were of your lineage. So some of the lineages were a little bit more about like benevolence and good karma and cultivating good karma. They were very much about inner alchemy and things like that, and more Buddhist in their flavor as well. And so a lot of times they're going to be more stringent. It's more about divination. No fortune telling was allowed. No predictions were allowed in terms of changing people's fate and meddling in people's fate. You want to leave people to fend for their fates on their own. And the diviner is only supposed to be a seer. You can see things, but you can't tell. It's a little, they're very nuanced, but we do make that distinction. Fortune tellers would say something like, "Oh, you should go with John. Yeah, marry John." But the seer is not necessarily going to say that. They might say, "Well, I see that your higher purpose is this," and it doesn't seem to answer the question. So, for example, if the querent says, "Should I marry John?" the seer might say something like, "I see that your higher purpose is to, I don't know, write this book and to live in New York State." It doesn't seem like the seer has answered the question, right? It doesn't answer the question directly. But if you have ever experienced Chinese divination, that's kind of how it is. It doesn't seem like the answer answers your question. You're like, what the hell? And then much later you start to, oh, okay, so actually it did answer your question. If you stuck with John and you didn't end up writing the book and going to live wherever, then you would always feel lost and you would resent John. But if you did this, then John might move and marry and follow. So the seer did answer the question. Fortune telling is more like, yeah, you should stay with John. John's great. Or no, you don't want John. John's no good. I see Bob over here. Bob is up ahead over here in New York. So why don't you go to New York and meet Bob in New York? So that's more of a fortune telling vibe. And you do see these distinctions based on lineages and the type of sort of backgrounds, magical backgrounds that practitioners come from. So there are other Taoist lineages that are more into the fortune telling. They also incorporate magic. A lot of the ways they use the I Ching is going to be tethered with food talisman crafting, sigil crafting, and things like that. So again, it's so diverse is the main point I want to make. It's incredibly diverse. There's no way to sort of cohesively say one thing or the other. Now, if you're a solitary practitioner and you're not part of any specific lineage, then again, the Eastern divinatory traditions are a little bit different, I think, from some of the Western traditions. So, for example, having studied Western astrology and tarot in the Western world, both tarot and astrology, from a Western cultural perspective, come with a body of ethics. There's a lot of ethical implications and ethical guidelines that they debate, that they talk about, that they converse about. They disagree with, of course, but there is this idea of we should talk about ethics. in the East, I'm not saying that they're not ethical. They do have their own guidelines. It's governed very strongly by karma and all that. But I find that they're a lot more open to talking about curses, talking about death, talking about pregnancies, predicting pregnancies, talking third-party readings where they read for people who aren't. There's a lot of things that I think in the Chinese fortune-telling culture that flies, that won't necessarily fly in a Western culture. So there's a very big difference that I see. I think growing up in a Western tradition, there's a lot of talk of ethics. In the Eastern tradition, it's more of a talk of craft and learning to hone your craft, and then you have to follow that craft becomes bound within your religious construct. So either you're Taoist or you're Buddhist, or you're going to dictate the way you perform divinations by your religion. So in terms of the Chinese fortune-telling culture or the divination culture that I personally grew up with, I was never taught any code of ethics, but what I was taught is a little bit interesting. It's a twist on the code of ethics, actually. So I was taught to listen to what you might refer to as spirit guides, but it was this idea of listening to my higher angels. And there was a presumption that if I sought divination and I opened the floodgates to receive that sort of divinatory information, I might get A, B, C, D, E, F, G. And so A, B, C, D, E, F, G would come through. But as it comes through, there's going to be a guardian, like a threshold guardian, or some kind of personal spirit guide of some kind that keeps me in check, that will say, okay, you can only tell that person ABC, you cannot tell that person DEFG. And so part of the diviner's responsibility is to always listen to that guide, because that guide is your threshold guardian. That guide protects you. It protects your own karma. And again, I'm not saying this is what you have to do. I'm just kind of sharing with you different perspectives. So this was sort of what I was taught. I wasn't taught about third-party readings. You can't read about death. You can read about death. Don't read about love. Don't read about low magics. Like those things I was never taught. It was like anything goes, like in this general sense, but to listen to my guides in the sense that it was presumed that if I receive, like I said, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, if that voice tells me I can only say A, B, C, don't say D, E, F, G, then you have to listen. That's the ethical code. It's required of you as a responsible diviner to then listen to that voice and only reveal A, B, C, and not reveal the DEFG that you see clearly in the divination, but that voice says, no, this information is not to be shared at this time. So that was something that I grew up with that is a lot akin to ethical guidelines, maybe, but other than that, I was never taught any ethics. In terms of the text that you're getting, so there's a couple of translation notes, but it's more about the interpretation as well. So every time you see the sage is the higher self. Crossing the great stream, you're going to see the phrase crossing the great stream repeated several times throughout the text. And that basically is, if you're talking about Western mystery traditions, is the equivalent of the great work. Or a great undertaking. In mundane terms, it's the task at hand, the objective at hand. It's a great undertaking, a huge project, a challenge. So crossing the great stream. Every single I Ching hexagram can essentially be summarized as either it's auspicious to cross the great stream, and so basically it's a green light, go, keep going, yes, it's good, or it is not auspicious to cross the great stream at this time, in which case the divination is a red light. It's like, stop, don't go, keep, stay where you are, or change direction. So every single hexagram, the divination ultimately is either a green light, go, or a red light, no, stop, go in a different direction. And it's just a funny thing, So when you see crossing the great stream, it just means whether or not to continue on that path, whether or not to go forward with the undertaking. You also see there is no blame throughout the text. When you see there is no blame, I don't know if I said this before in an earlier video or if I was saying it in a video reading I just did recently. Everything's a big mess in my head. I'm so sorry. But when you see there is no blame, it basically means shit happens. When the oracle says to you there is no blame, just, oh, I did say this in a video. It just means, you know, don't look for the root cause. Don't look for a culprit. Don't look to blame somebody. Don't look for a scapegoat. So it's giving you whatever message it is, and then it's instructing or advising you, but don't go looking for a scapegoat, you know, or don't go looking for what caused this or trying to figure out what it is. You know, this is just something that you have to deal with, and you just have to be like water and go with the flow. Another thing that is interesting is whenever in your book, when you see the second person you, or when you see no, not second person, sorry, when you see first person I, so when the text literally says I or me, that's in the original Chinese. And it's interesting because in a couple of rare occasions in the text, the oracle seems to address itself, or it gets very meta, and it sort of has a consciousness, and it says, I am saying something to you. And so every once in a while, it seems like my tenses, or you know how if you're a writer, you have to have consistent point of view. You shouldn't switch around point of view. It's either all in third person, all in first person, all in second person, right? So this is sort of, you want to be consistent with your point of view within one body of text. But in the I Ching, if you read the original verses, it's not consistent in the point of view. There are a couple of places that become second person. There are a couple of places that's first person, and then most of it, of course, is third person. So that's something interesting. It's not my inconsistency. It is actually part of the original text. Now, one of the objectives I had for this course is that it can be self-contained. So if you want to learn I Ching, you can just take this course. I gave you my book, and so you don't need to buy any additional texts. So I really wanted that where you did have access to the I Ching Book of Changes, and one that did have sort of a stronger interest and attentiveness to origins and to a more occult leaning, as opposed to some of the Western perspectives that would, like Wilhelm, for example, eliminated a lot of what I found to be glaring in the original text, but it was left out in terms of the subtext in the translations. So I tried to bring that back, but anyway, that's neither here nor there. If you do want to take, if you find that you really take to the I Ching, and if this is something you want to take further and study further, then this book's not enough. You really want to study different perspectives, multiple points of view, and see how other people interpret it. I can just give you a sense of what I have. So a lot of Westerners don't like this, but I love it. This one is not popular among Westerners because it is very obscure, but I feel like this is the best translation of the I Ching, and it's a literal translation. So when you look at it, one side is the Chinese text, and the other side is literally a translation into English, and it's by, I think he's a professor of physics at MIT. It's by Kirsten Huang. I actually contacted him and I talked to him. He created a second edition. This is the first edition from a really long time. So there's an updated, revised version by Dr. Kirsten Huang, or Professor Kirsten Huang. So look into him. He's really, really cool. I was so, like, you know, starstruck, and like I was a little fangirl talking to him, because I grew up with this book. This is the book that I grew up with. So hopefully he's still alive. But he was alive the last time I talked to him, and he's wonderful. And so this is really the translation that I absolutely, this is Kirsten, Professor Kirsten Huang, by the way. So this is the translation that I would absolutely recommend. But when I talk to Westerners, and no one likes it. I feel like I'm the only one who likes it. I don't know why, but it's just so, you know, there's a caveat. Um, Another really good translation with annotations is the leg, Legge. Leg is another famous one. So Wilhelm is a very famous one. Leg, Legge is another famous one. This is one that I really like. I find that it's a pretty good. It does a pretty decent job, and it leaves a lot for you to interpret. So this is pretty good. Um, Now, in terms of not necessarily translations, but more like interpretations, so now we're talking about plain English. The text is written in plain English. Brian Brown Walker does a really good job. It's very small. It's a thin, pretty easy to, very compact book, and it does a pretty good job sort of interpreting the I Ching. And so these are not translations. This is plain English. Absolutely anybody can pick it up and read it. In fact, you can use this to sort of interpret the 64 hexagrams when you're doing divination. So this is very good for interpreting. Another very good one is Palmer. Richard Palmer. This again is an interpretation of the lines. And oh, there is something I want to brag about and show you in the Richard Palmer book, if I can find it. Is it still here? I can't remember. Oh, okay, I just wanted to show you that. Oh, look at that. So I'm just showing you to disclose bias, because there is probably personal bias, but the author wishes to express his gratitude to Benebell Wen for her valuable contribution to this work. So, there's a bias. Of course, I'm going to recommend this book, but objectively, if it wasn't good, he does a really good job. So he did a really good job sort of, distilling the hexagrams into plain English, and the way it's a really good one. So this is something I would recommend as well for further study if you're interested. I will write out the titles in the supplemental handouts for you to have in case you want to look it up.